All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're doing something a little different, a little darker. We're stepping way back in time to 1848, right into the middle of a small English village that was just absolutely ravaged by a deadly epidemic. It's an incredible look at how real history, sheer panic, and honestly, some pretty severe medical limitations all collided to create a mystery that people are still talking about today. So we're going to break down exactly what went down on one very terrifying night and see if we can separate the hard historical facts from the enduring legends.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really get what happened here, we've got to start with this incredibly ominous warning. The village priest gave this very strict advice to a young gravekeeper named Thomas. He told him, never stay in the graveyard after the last bell rings. Sounds like a horror movie, right? But Thomas, he was young, he kind of just laughed it off. He wasn't buying into the local campfire stories or the ghost folklore. He had a massive job to do. Because the casualties were piling up so fast, he literally had no choice but to keep working well past sunset.
Section 1. The 1848 Village Epidemic.
Let's move to and see how this builds across our timeline here. Because you have to remember, this village was absolutely paralyzed by fear. The death toll was so incredibly high that these burials were completely rushed. So at sunset, you've got Thomas working in the dark, shoveling dirt over victims long after everyone else is locked safely inside their homes. Then we hit near midnight. This is the big turning point. A single church bell completely shatters the silence. And then, jumping to the next day, we see the tragic aftermath. Thomas is found totally frozen in shock. To figure out what happened in that dark window between midnight and morning, we have to put ourselves right in his shoes.
Section 2. The Midnight Bell.
Picture this for a second. It's approaching midnight. The entire village is dead silent. The only sound is Thomas shoveling dirt onto a fresh grave. And then, out of absolutely nowhere, an impossible sound cuts through the dark. Dong. Just one single ring. Now, Thomas freezes instantly, and it wasn't just because it was late. It was because he knew, for a fact, that the church doors were locked tight for the night. The building was completely 100% empty. There was literally no one inside who could have pulled that bell rope.
He waits, and then, a few agonizing moments later, the silence breaks again. Dong, dong, dong. 3 more consecutive rings. The tension here is just off the charts. This wasn't the wind, you know? It wasn't some random echo. It was deliberate. So driven by this crazy mix of duty and total dread, Thomas grabs his lantern and starts this long, agonizing walk away from the fresh grave, right toward those locked church doors.
And this brilliantly illustrates the horrifying physical evidence Thomas discovers when he gets there. Let's look at the clues. First, he checks the heavy doors. They are indeed locked. But right there, leading up from the muddy cemetery to the entrance, are fresh footprints, muddy footprints. Thomas slowly pushes the door open. He looks around. The interior is totally empty, just like he thought. But then he looks up and sees the final piece of the puzzle. The bell rope is still actively swinging back and forth. Something or someone had just pulled it.
Suddenly, right from the dark shadows behind him, he hears this faint whisper. "Help me." Thomas turns around, super slowly, lifting his lantern to see. And standing there, near the altar, is a pale woman. Now here's why his lantern actually slipped from his shaking hand and shattered on the floor. He recognized her. Instantly. It was a victim of the epidemic. Actually, it was a woman he had personally buried that very same morning. Wow, right? So we're left staring at this massive question. Was this some sort of ghost straight out of local folklore, or was it something much worse? This is where we need to make a sharp pivot in this explainer. Because while that whole campfire ghost story is undeniably terrifying, the actual historical reality of what most likely happened in that church that night, it's so much more gruesome.
Section 3. A gruesome historical truth. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it logically breaks down the tragic chain of events. Remember, they found Thomas completely speechless the next morning. To understand what he actually saw, we have to dig into the historical reality. Step 1, the sheer scale of this epidemic meant burials were rushed, incredibly rushed. Step 2, we have to factor in the medical knowledge, or rather the lack thereof, in 1848. Doctors back then routinely mistook deep comas or severe shock for actual death, and that led to this very real, incredibly horrifying problem: accidental live burials. Which brings us to step 3. To prevent that unthinkable nightmare, some coffins were built with a desperate failsafe. They attached a string inside the casket that ran all the way up through the dirt, connected to a bell above ground.
Yeah,
They were literally called safety coffins. The definition here is pretty straightforward. It's a mechanism designed to stop someone from being buried alive by letting them ring a bell above ground. So, that ringing Thomas heard, it wasn't magic, it wasn't a ghost, it was the desperate, frantic plea of a living human being who had just woken up in pitch blackness, trapped 6 feet under, pulling a string to tell the world, hey, I'm still alive. Those muddy footprints, they belonged to a woman who had miraculously managed to claw her way out of a shallow, rushed grave. It is just this stark, chilling reminder of how terrifying medical ignorance used to be, and exactly what our ancestors had to do to avoid that fate.
Section 4. The legend lives on.
So, the crucial point is how we weigh these two surviving narratives against each other, because both versions of this story have survived to this day in this small town. On one side, we've got the medical reality. A living victim of the epidemic, mistakenly buried alive, wakes up, pulls the string, frees herself, and stumbles into the church for help. But on the other side, you have the village legend, the deep-seated belief that Thomas really did encounter a spirit, hearing the voice of someone who had already crossed over into death. Now, for this explainer, we aren't here to tell you which one you should believe. We just want to show you how historical trauma creates these dual narratives. The safety coffin logic perfectly explains the physical clues, but the sheer terror of that epidemic, that is what cemented the ghost story into the town's DNA forever.
Which brings us to a final, lingering thought. That epidemic ended over a century and a half ago. Those safety coffins have long since rotted away in the dirt. And yet, the villagers still tell the story of Thomas the Gravekeeper. And they swear up and down that on stormy nights, when the wind is really howling through that cemetery, you can still hear the old church bell ringing all by itself. So is it just the wind echoing through a drafty old tower, or is it the lingering memory of those buried alive? Honestly, the echo of 1848 just refuses to be silenced. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this dive into history and legend gave you a lot to think about.